Her mother's wedding night advice was simple. Close your eyes, endure, and never expect pleasure. But when the Duke carried her across the threshold, his first words shattered everything she'd been taught about duty. My dear listeners, if my sweet grandmother hears we've hit 1,000 subscribers, she'll finally spill all her scandalous Regency-era tea she's been hoarding for decades, and trust me, Granny doesn't disappoint. Wherever you're tuning in from today, whether it's a cozy corner in Benin City, a rainy afternoon in London, or somewhere across the globe, drop a quick comment below telling us your spot. Smash that like button if this tale already has your heart racing, and hit subscribe so we can keep delivering these swoony stories straight to you. Your support means the world and keeps Granny's stories flowing. Calderwood, October 1868. The morning of her wedding day arrived with a crisp autumn chill, golden leaves swirling against the gray stone of the countryside chapel, as if the season itself was holding its breath for what was to come. 26-year-old Isadora Penhallow stood before the tall looking-glass in the quiet vestry, her reflection showing a woman radiating a luminous yet resigned beauty. Her warm, honey-brown hair was swept into an elegant, voluminous updo adorned with delicate jeweled combs, and her fair skin glowed against the pristine ivory gown. Yet, despite the intricate lace detailing and the fitted bodice that accentuated her graceful form, her warm brown eyes held a shadow of apprehension. Today, she would pledge her life to Alaric Dunmere, the Duke of Calderwood, a steadfast figure whose reputation for solitary duty preceded him. The union was a practical alliance intended to restore her family's dwindling fortunes while providing the Duke with a steady, empathetic companion. She had met the Duke only 3 times before this day, their exchanges formal and distant, his expression difficult to read. He was an imposing figure, towering and broad-shouldered, with thick chestnut hair and intense hazel eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. Yet his refined bearing and his tailored black evening dress offered no clue to the man beneath the title. Isadora harbored no romantic illusions about this union. She understood her role to be a dutiful, supportive duchess who would manage his manor and endure the intimacies of marriage with silent obedience. The heavy oak door creaked open, and her mother swept in, her expression pinched and severe, the face of a woman who had long ago surrendered joy for propriety. She closed the door firmly behind her, turning to her daughter not with warmth, but with the cold resolve of a matron instructing a novice. What followed was a conversation Isadora would struggle to forget, words that would ring mercilessly in her ears throughout the ceremony, filling her with a coiling, heavy dread. Her mother's counsel was stark, clinical, and utterly devoid of affection. Tonight, when the Duke claimed his rights, Isadora was to close her eyes, lie still, and endure without sound, lest she appear improper. "It is the burden of our sex to simply bear it," her mother had whispered, adjusting the final lace on Isadora's veil with a sharp, joyless tug. "Do not debase yourself with noise or movement. Close your eyes, Isadora. Think of the household accounts. Think of your duty. Think of anything but the act itself." The advice settled like a cold stone in Isadora's stomach, weighing her down more than the layers of satin and crinoline. She had nodded, mute and pale, accepting the bleak forecast of her future as a necessary sacrifice for her family's survival. The ceremony that followed passed in a haze of gray stone and muted whispers. When she finally stood beside Alaric Dunmere at the altar, he loomed over her, a mountain of black broadcloth and stiff propriety. He was terrifyingly grand, a man built for command and solitude. Yet, when the vicar instructed them to join hands, the Duke's grip was not the crushing clamp of ownership she had feared. His large palm engulfed hers, warm and calloused, but shockingly steady, his thumb brushing ever so slightly against her trembling knuckles in a rhythmic, soothing motion. She dared a glance upward, meeting those intense hazel eyes. For a fleeting second, the austere mask of the Duke seemed to slip, revealing a depth of concern, perhaps even softness, that startled her. But the moment vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the solemnity of their vows. The hours waned into the velvet darkness of night, and soon the heavy oak doors of the ducal chamber shut out the world, sealing them in a silence amplified by the crackle of the hearth. Isidora stood frozen near the threshold, her breath shallow, her mother's voice a relentless, toxic chant in her mind. Lie still, endure. Sudden movement broke her trance as Alaric stepped closer. The scent of sandalwood and crisp autumn air clung to him, overwhelming her senses. He did not bark orders or tear at his cravat in haste. Instead, he swept her into his arms with an effortless strength that stole her breath. As he carried her toward the center of the room, Isidora squeezed her eyes shut, her body rigid, bracing for the callous claiming she had been promised. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, terrified of the impending ordeal. But as he held her against his chest, she felt the thunderous beat of his own heart, not calm, but racing in time with hers. Was it possible that the imposing Duke felt something other than cold entitlement, or was this merely the predator's excitement before the kill? Alaric did not cast her onto the bed as the brute of her mother's warnings would have. Instead, he lowered her feet to the thick Persian rug, his hands lingering at her waist only long enough to ensure she was steady before he stepped back, creating a respectful distance between them. The silence that stretched was not heavy with threat, but thick with hesitation. Isidora kept her eyes squeezed shut, her breath hitching, waiting for the demand, for the rough hands. "Open your eyes, Isidora." His voice was low, a grumble of granite wrapped in velvet. "Please." She obeyed slowly, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks. Alaric was not looming over her. He had pulled a chair close and sat, bringing his face level with hers. The harsh lines of his jaw were softened by the candlelight, and his hazel eyes held a profound sadness mixed with resolve. "You are shaking," he observed quietly. "You have been told that tonight is a tax you must pay for your title, haven't you?" Isidora could not speak. She only nodded, shame heating her neck. Alaric reached out, not to seize her, but to take her hand, turning it over to trace the lifeline on her palm with his thumb. "Then what you were told was a lie. I have lived a life of cold duty, Isidora, of hollow rooms and silent halls. I will not bring that chill into our marriage bed." He looked deep into her eyes, his intensity searing. "Hear me well. I do not want your submission. I want your joy. In this chamber and in this life, your pleasure matters first, always. I will never take what is not freely and eagerly given." The words hung in the air, revolutionary and terrifying. They dismantled the very foundation of her upbringing. "But my mother said to endure," she whispered, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. "Then we shall prove her wrong," Alaric replied, a faint, crooked smile touching his lips. The tension in her shoulders began to unspool. He did not blow out the candles. Instead, he asked her a question no one had ever bothered to ask. "Tell me, Isidora, when you are not being a dutiful daughter, what sets your mind alight?" Hesitantly at first, then with growing fervor, they spoke. The night did not become an ordeal of flesh, but a meeting of minds. She told him of her secret longing to see the Italian coast, of the books she hid beneath her mattress because they were deemed too intellectual for a lady. Alaric listened, truly listened, his gaze fixed on her animated face as if she were the only source of light in the room. He spoke of his own regrets, of the loneliness that a dukedom carved into a man. As the candle wax dripped low, Isidora looked at the man sitting opposite her. The dread was gone, replaced by a bewildering, fragile hope. This was not the behavior of a man who had purchased a possession. It was the overture of a man seeking a partner. The days at Calderwood Manor bled into a golden haze of crisp autumn walks and quiet revelations. The estate, with its sprawling woodlands of amber and russet, became a sanctuary where Isadora's old fears were slowly dismantled, brick by brick. They spent hours wandering the frost-kissed gardens, Isadora's hand tucked securely in the crook of Alaric's arm, no longer trembling, but resting there with a sense of belonging. He spoke to her of crop rotations and tenant laws, valuing her mind as much as her company, and in the evenings the library became their haven. It was by the firelight that the true transformation occurred. Alaric remained true to his revolutionary promise. He made no demands, only invitations. One evening, as the wind howled against the leaded panes, he knelt before her on the hearthrug, unlacing her boots with a reverence that made her breath hitch. When his hands moved upward to cup her face, his thumbs brushing the sensitive skin of her jaw, the heat that flared in Isadora's chest was not shame, but a startling, ravenous curiosity. "Profound intimacy," he murmured against her lips, his kiss tasting of brandy and patience. "It is not something to be stolen, Isadora. It is a conversation." Under his gentle tutelage, the bedroom ceased to be a place of dread. He taught her the language of her own body, waiting for her nod, her sigh, her permission before deepening his touch. When pleasure finally bloomed, unexpected and blindingly bright, it shattered the last of her mother's grim teachings. She had not closed her eyes. She had kept them wide open, watching the awe on her husband's face as he witnessed her unravel. She realized with a jolt that her mother had been wrong about everything. This was not endurance. It was a symphony. And for the first time in her life, Isadora felt vivid, powerful, and undeniably alive. But the world outside the manor gates was not so kind. The idyll was punctured one morning by the arrival of the post from London. As Isadora poured tea in the sunlit breakfast room, she noticed Alaric stiffen as he read a missive stamped with a ducal crest. He crumpled the paper, but not before Isadora caught the dark look that clouded his eyes. "Just business," he claimed, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. Later, she found the discarded Society Gazette he had tried to hide. The ink seemed to hiss with malice. "One wonders what the Duke of Calderwood sees in such a plain, provincial creature," the column sneered, anonymously penned but sharp as a dagger. "Surely a man of his stature requires a diamond, not a pebble found by the roadside. One hears the Penhallow coffers were empty, a purchase, not a match." The words blurred before Isadora's eyes, the cold seep of insecurity returning to chill the warmth Alaric had so carefully kindled. The sanctuary was breached, the whispers had begun. The safety of the countryside dissolved the moment the carriage entered the smog-choked embrace of London. While Alaric remained a pillar of strength, Isadora felt the collective gaze of the ton pressing against the windows, assessing and dismissing her in the same breath. It was at a fashionable tea salon, amidst the clinking of porcelain and the rustle of expensive silk, that the blow finally landed. Seeking a moment of respite, Isadora had stepped behind a heavy velvet curtain near the conservatory. She froze as two familiar, sharp voices drifted from the other side. "It really is tragic," Lady Danbury's haughty contralto cut through the air, "to see a man of Calderwood's magnificence saddled with such a beige little thing. One assumes the dowry was the only attraction, though even that was pitiful." "Oh, it wasn't the money," another voice tittered cruelly. "He needs an heir, and she looks the type to lie back and produce one without making a fuss. A decorative mute, nothing more. He'll be back in the arms of a mistress by winter, mark my words. A man like that cannot survive on bread and water when he is used to wine." The cruelty struck with the precision of a surgeon's knife, severing the fragile confidence Isadora had built over the last few weeks. The vibrant woman who had laughed in the library vanished. In her place, the ghost of her mother's warnings rose up, triumphant and sneering. "Foolish girl," the inner voice hissed, "to think he could desire you for anything but duty. You are nothing but a vessel." When Alaric returned that evening, his face bright with the anticipation of sharing news of a play he wished to attend, he found a stranger in his wife's chair. Isadora sat rigid, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. When he reached out to brush a stray curl from her cheek, a gesture that usually made her lean into his touch, she flinched, pulling away with a sharp intake of breath. "I am indisposed, Your Grace," she said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth he had come to crave. She used his title like a shield, pushing him miles away. "I shall retire early, alone." My dear listeners, if this moment of doubt tugs at your heart, if you fear losing this budding love as much as Isadora does, don't let the story end here without subscribing. Hit that button now so you never miss how she fights back. Those who skip it, well, drop in the comments and lament why you'd leave her in the dark. Alaric's hand dropped to his side, the rejection striking him visibly. The hurt in his hazel eyes was stark, a mixture of confusion and profound pain, but Isadora forced herself to look away. She was terrified that if she met his gaze, she would crumble, or worse, see the pity she was sure he now felt. She retreated behind the walls of cold propriety, leaving her husband standing alone in the center of the room, the silence between them no longer a comfort, but a widening, icy chasm. The silence in the London townhouse became unbearable, a suffocating fog that dampened even the brightest hearth fire. Alaric, perceiving that the ghost haunting his wife was not merely the gossip of strangers, but the ingrained voice of her upbringing, finally broke the impasse. He found her staring blankly into the garden, her posture rigid. "You are carrying a burden that is not yours to bear," he said gently, placing a hand on the back of her chair, but not touching her, respecting the distance she had enforced. "Go to her, Isadora. Confront the shadow where it lives, or it will forever darken our door." Isadora arrived at her childhood home under a slate-gray sky. The vicarage, once the entirety of her world, now felt small and stifling, smelling of old lavender and repressed sighs. Her mother sat in the parlor, stitching a hem with aggressive precision, her face a mask of permanent disapproval. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in Isadora's fine silk gown, a visible symbol of the transaction she had orchestrated. "I see you are playing the part well," Mrs. Penhallow remarked dryly, not rising to greet her. "I trust you have remained silent and dutiful?" "No," Isadora said, her voice trembling slightly before finding a steel core she hadn't known she possessed. "I have not been silent, and I have not endured." Her needle paused. "What foolishness is this?" "You were wrong," Isadora declared, the words rushing out like a dam breaking. "You told me marriage was a cage, that pleasure was a myth, and that men were incapable of gentleness. You lied. Alaric, he is kind, he listens, and there is joy in our union, Mother, true, vibrant joy that you never told me existed because you never dared to seek it yourself." Mrs. Penhallow set her embroidery down with a snap. Her face did not soften with understanding. Instead, it twisted into a bitter sneer. "Joy?" she spat, the words sounding like a curse. "You are a child playing dress-up. Do not come here preaching of joy. Give him a year, Isadora. When the novelty fades and he turns to his clubs and his mistresses, you will remember my warnings. You are not special. You are merely fresh." The venom in the words stung, but as Isadora looked at the bitter woman before her, the fear evaporated. She realized with sudden, blinding clarity that her mother's advice had never been wisdom. It had been a projection of her own misery. Mrs. Penhallow wanted Isadora to be miserable, for happiness would be an indictment of her own wasted life. "I may lose him, or I may not," Isadora said softly, a profound weight lifting from her chest. "But I will not lose myself to your bitterness. I choose hope." She turned and walked out of the parlor, leaving her mother in the gloom. The air outside tasted sweeter, sharper. The carriage ride back to Alaric felt like a journey toward the sun. She had faced the origin of her pain and survived. Now, with her heart unburdened and her spirit reclaimed, she was ready to face London. Let the ton whisper. She had a truth they could never touch. The invite to Lady Sterling's salon had been a challenge wrapped in cream cardstock, and Isadora accepted it with a newfound steel in her spine. The drawing room was a suffocating garden of silk and malice, filled with the very matrons who had whispered behind their fans days prior. Isadora stood near the pianoforte, her chin high, refusing to shrink into the drapery as she once might have. The attack came swiftly. Lady Louisa, a striking beauty who had long campaigned for Alaric's hand, swept forward, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Duchess," she purred, her voice carrying easily over the lull in conversation. "How brave of you to venture out. We were just discussing the Duke's renowned charity. It is truly saintly of him to elevate a woman of such modest origins. One wonders, does he find the conversation at dinner terribly tedious, or does he simply enjoy the silence of a compliant decoration?" The room went deathly quiet. A week ago, Isadora would have fled in tears. Today, the echo of her mother's bitterness reminded her that cruelty was merely a mask for unhappiness. Isadora set her tea saucer down with a deliberate, delicate clink. "You mistake silence for emptiness, Lady Louisa," Isadora replied, her voice soft but ringing with clear, bell-like precision. "Alaric does not require a decoration nor a performer. He desired a partner, and I have found that true conversation requires a heart capable of listening, a skill the tongue often forgets in favor of the sound of its own voice." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Lady Louisa's smile faltered, her face flushing a mottled red. Before she could retort, the heavy double doors swung open. Alaric stood there, windswept and imposing, his hazel eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Isadora. The tension in his shoulders visibly broke the moment he saw her standing tall, unyielding. He ignored the bowing gentlemen and curtsying ladies, striding directly to his wife's side. He took her gloved hand, not in a possessive grip, but in a gesture of utter reverence, raising it to his lips before the entire assembly. "Forgive my lateness, my love," he said, his voice deep and audible to every stunned observer. "The House of Lords was unbearable today. I found myself desperate for the only company in London that offers me both peace and brilliance." He turned his gaze to Lady Louisa, his expression cooling to absolute zero. "I trust my wife has been entertaining you. She has a wit that far surpasses my own." The shift was palpable. In one sentence, the Duke had transformed Isadora from a pitiable charity case into the coveted treasure of a powerful man. The sneers dissolved into uncertain smiles, the tide turning with dizzying speed. Yet, as Alaric tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, Isadora knew this was merely a skirmish. The grand ball at Calderwood House loomed 3 days hence, the true battlefield where their victory would either be cemented in history or shattered by scandal. The grand ballroom of Calderwood House was a galaxy of crystal chandeliers and swirling velvet, but for Isadora, the dazzling spectacle held no terror. She stood at Alaric's side, no longer the beige little thing of the rumors, but a duchess radiant in sapphire silk, her head held high. When the music faded for the customary address, the room turned toward the Duke, expecting a dry recitation of lineage and estate profits. Alaric raised his glass, his eyes finding Isadora's with a warmth that scorched the watching crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not merely tradition, but the future," he announced, his voice carrying to the furthest alcove. "For too long, society has valued a woman's silence over her spirit. My wife has taught me that a marriage without a meeting of minds is a hollow shell. Therefore, it is my honor to announce the establishment of the Isadora Dunmere Foundation, dedicated to the education and advancement of young women who, like my Duchess, possess brilliance the world has tried to dim." A shocked silence was followed by thunderous applause. The decorative mute was now a patron of intellect. Alaric turned to her, raising his glass higher. "To Isadora, my equal, my conscience, and my heart, may we never simply endure, but always live." The toast signaled a definitive victory. The whispers of the ton were silenced not by scandal, but by the undeniable force of a partnership rooted in respect. Months later, the frantic energy of the season had given way to the hushed sanctity of a winter evening. The fire crackled in the very chamber where Isadora had once stood trembling in fear. Now she sat curled against Alaric's chest on the rug, the bond between them forged in the fires of consent and mutual pleasure. Isadora took his hand, guiding it gently to the soft curve of her abdomen. "Do you remember my mother's warning that I must produce an heir as a tax for my position?" Alaric went still, his eyes widening as he looked at her. "Isadora?" "She was wrong about that, too," she whispered, a tear of pure happiness slipping down her cheek. "We will have a child, Alaric, but this life within me was not created in silence or endurance. It was made in joy. It is a child of passion, chosen freely by us both." My dear listeners, if this beautiful ending fills you with hope and warmth, if you want more tales where love wins over duty, subscribe right now before you close this. Imagine missing the next one. And if you still won't, head to the comments and honestly tell us why you'd walk away from such joy. Alaric buried his face in her hair, overcome with emotion. They had broken the cycle of generational pain. They had rewritten the rules of their world, proving that a woman's voice is her greatest asset and her pleasure her divine right. Their story did not end in the cold endurance of duty, but in the warm, endless light of celebrated passion.